In programs I started to do on this channel back in February, directly following the fall of Avdiivka, I pointed out that panic was starting to take a hold on Western capitals when it became clear, following the fall of Avdiivka, that the narrative that Western governments had spun for themselves about the situation in Ukraine, that the war was deadlocked and in stalemate, was not true. And in various recent programs, I've said that panic, something I have a great deal of experience on from my professional life, has a habit of experiencing ebbs and flows. It's usually always there to some extent in the background until the cause for it is removed, but it can be interspersed with periods of superficial calm and even euphoria. But when the causes of that panic flare up, the panic always returns with renewed force. Well, I'm going to make a rather bold prediction. I think we are going to start to see panic return in a big way in the West about the situation in Ukraine at some point over the next few weeks. And I think that over the last couple of days, the last 2 or 3 days in particular, we see the first few indications, pebbles, if you like, of the avalanche of panic that is coming. Anyway, those pebbles are now starting to trickle down the hill. I'm going to come to all of that later in this program. But of course, what is driving everything is the situation on the battle lines in Ukraine, and that's what I'm going to turn to first. Now, the first thing I'm going to discuss in terms of the overall situation on the battle lines is missile strikes which have taken place over the last couple of days between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The Russians, over and above the routine missile strikes that they launch on Ukrainian positions right across Ukraine, which are now essentially a daily and nightly event, they carried out a number of very powerful missile strikes over the last couple of days on Odessa. The Ukrainians, for their part, have been launching missile strikes, apparently now using exclusively ATACMS missiles on Crimea. Rybar, who is of course one of the most famous Russian reporting agencies of this war, recently claimed that the Ukrainians have used up to 30 ATACMS missiles in their recent strikes on Crimea. Well, I'm going to come to the Ukrainian strikes in a moment, but let's start with the Russian strikes on Odessa, about which we are now becoming very well informed, or much better informed. Firstly, I'd like to correct something I said in my last video. I spoke in my last video about how on the seashore near Odessa, a rather curious Gothic building, like a kind of small castle, had been struck. I understood at the time that it was some kind of military school. And of course, there were claims in the media in the West and from Ukraine that the missile that struck this building was one of the Russian missiles that had been launched against Odessa. And in my program yesterday, having no alternative information, I went along with that claim. However, over the last couple of hours, there's been significant pushback from Russian sources about this. Firstly, it turns out that the building, it was a purely civilian building, some kind of law academy or school. Secondly, it turns out that the missile that struck this building had a cluster warhead, and the Russians have been claiming that the missiles that they have been using to strike at Odessa do not have cluster warheads, and it would make no sense for them to launch missiles against Odessa with cluster warheads. The Russians have come up, therefore, with the alternative explanation that the missile which struck the building was a Ukrainian air defense missile, almost certainly a Buk M1 missile, which does have a cluster warhead. There have been many confirmed instances when Ukrainian air defense missiles have been launched and have failed to intercept incoming Russian missiles and have fallen to the ground and have struck buildings and caused damage and deaths amongst civilians. And I think that this is incontrovertibly true. Well, who is telling the truth about the strike on this building? The short answer is I don't know. Again, finding out would require an independent investigation. An independent investigation is never going to happen. On balance, I will say that I find the Russian explanation much more plausible. If this was a civilian building, then it's difficult to see why it would be a target at all and what the purpose of attacking it would be. And if Russian missiles actually don't use cluster warheads in their strikes on Odessa, well, that would be conclusive and would settle the matter. But as I said, I'm not going to claim that I have any knowledge of this. An investigation is the only way to establish the truth. As I always say when discussing attacks of this kind, that investigation will never happen, and we will continue to see claims about this attack, like all of the others, endlessly repeated by both sides, each sticking to their own narratives. Every so often, you get an admission, generally the American media, that Russian claims of missiles falling to the ground and doing damage are true. But I'm not saying that we're going to see anything like that about this particular attack. Anyway, what about the Russian missile strikes that did indeed happen against Odessa? Well, one of these missile strikes apparently again targeted a water drone facility. Now, the Ukrainians have been heavily using water drones at various times over the last few months to carry out strikes on Russian warships and on Russian installations, including, by the way, at least one attempted attack on the Kerch Bridge. I'm going to say that, in my opinion, these water drones have not had quite the effect that some of the more enthusiastic claims in the media, the Western media, have suggested. But they have been much more than just a nuisance. They have done some actual damage, and the Russians have been hunting them, or at least hunting the installations from which they are launched. A couple of weeks ago, they struck a building in Odessa where the drone operators were supposedly being trained, and where the drones were supposedly controlled from. That building was destroyed. Large numbers of people were killed. There were rumors that Western instructors had been caught up in the attack. Nobody has ever been able to confirm this, or at least no one has ever fully confirmed this, but those were the reports. And by the way, and for the record, I've noticed that there's been essentially a standstill in the further use of water drones since that attack? Well, we've now had a report of a further strike on an installation apparently about to launch more water drones. And apparently the installation was destroyed just as the water drones were about to be launched, and significant amount of damage was done, and the water drones were destroyed, and perhaps some of the operators as well. Anyway, that was one attack. There have been two other attacks, so far as I can tell, in Odessa, and maybe they are actually, in some respects, more serious. One is that the Russians are claiming that they struck the building of Ukraine's army group South, the one that controls the Ukrainian military in the area, and that they did significant damage, and that this building was destroyed, and presumably a lot of high-ranking personnel were caught up in this attack and were probably killed. Well, that's one strike. We have it almost entirely from the Russians that the strike occurred. It's not clear where this building was located. Again, I can only report what the Russians are saying. The third strike is a different matter. Apparently, it was on a railway facility. There was a devastation in the area, major sounds of explosions. The Ukrainian security forces have established a cordoning off a large part of this area. Ambulances and other vehicles from the emergency services have been pouring into this area. It looks as if a troop train of some kind might have been hit. That's my own guess, but certainly it looks as if all the indications suggest that very significant damage was done. So 3 apparently effective strikes happening, by the way, taking place over a period of around 3 days. These were separate attacks. Now, the Ukrainians have also been launching multiple attacks on Crimea, and about these we have far less information. But yesterday, the Russian authorities, including our old friends Saldo and Rogov, were talking about these strikes on Crimea, as was Sergei Aksyonov, the head of the Crimea regional government. And what all 3 of these Russian officials basically suggested was that the strikes with these ATACMS missiles have been completely unsuccessful. Presumably that all of these ATACMS missiles that the Ukrainians have launched have been shot down. Again, I have no third-party corroboration of this. I am not sure what the Ukrainians themselves are saying. But if it is true that the Ukrainians have launched up to 30 ATACMS missiles in various strikes against Crimea, ever since the first strike on the Jankoy air base about a week ago, then this is a very, very profligate use of ATACMS missiles, which are apparently in relatively short supply. Now, it's been suggested that all the ATACMS missiles used up to this time are the shorter-ranged, older versions with the cluster warheads. The Ukrainians have not yet used the longer-ranged ATACMS missiles with the unitary warheads. And presumably those have been saved up for the major attack, which will be the attack on the Kerch Bridge or other targets that the Ukrainians have selected, which are perhaps more important than those we have seen up to now. Now, a number of points to be made. It could be that the Russians are not telling us the truth, and that some of these missiles have indeed got through and have done damage. But if it is indeed the case that the Russians are shooting down these ATACMS missiles in large numbers, then it looks as if, even allowing for the fact that the ATACMS missiles which are being used up to now are the older version, well, it suggests that perhaps they're not quite as effective as we were led to believe. Now, I say this very tentatively because I don't know, but I have been doing a little bit of research of my own. I'm not expert in this area, so please don't take this as authoritative. But it seems to me that back in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Americans and the Soviets each introduced what might be called guided missiles, battlefield missiles, into their respective armies. Missiles which had fairly similar roles and capabilities. One was the ATACMS, which entered service with the US military, and the other was the Tochka U, which simultaneously entered service with the Soviet military. Now, they are very similar missiles in some respects, at least in terms, I think, of what they were intended to do, which is that they were intended to be used by armies on the battlefield. In other words, these are battlefield weapons, not long-range strike weapons. Now, there are differences. The Tochka U has a higher speed, apparently over Mach 5, but it only has a range of around 70 to 100 kilometers, whereas the ATACMS has a lower speed, around Mach 3, but with potentially a significantly longer range, going all the way up to 300 kilometers. Both missiles, in other words, are supersonic, but the Russians went for speed over range, and the Russians went for range, and the Americans went for range over speed. Both are precision guided. This was the time when battlefield missiles started to become precision guided. Guidance systems have, since that time, improved, by the way, very significantly. But anyway, we're looking at two fairly similar missiles. The Russians have repeatedly shown that they can intercept Tochka U missiles, which the Ukrainians still use. It is relatively rare for Tochka U missiles to be able to penetrate Russian defenses. Given that the Tochka U has a higher speed than the ATACMS, but both are ballistic missiles, supersonic ballistic missiles, I would have thought that if the Russians can handle the Tochka U, they can probably handle the ATACMS. That's my guess. Now, I ought to say the Russians no longer use the Tochka U. It was taken out of service with the Russian military before the special military operation began. I see that Wikipedia tries to persuade us otherwise, but about that I have no doubt. The Russians instead use the far more modern and far more powerful Iskander, specifically the Iskander M, which has a much more advanced rocket engine, and which is, by the way, much more accurate. Both rocket engines and guidance have improved significantly since the 1980s. And for comparison, the land-based version of the Iskander M has a speed of between Mach 6 and 7, which makes it effectively a hypersonic missile, and it has a longer range than the ATACMS. So it is a much more powerful missile altogether. Now, again, I'm just making these points, but why shouldn't I? The Ukrainians have admitted that they are not able to shoot down Iskander-M missiles. The Russians have demonstrated a capability to shoot down Tochka-Us. They have a much more advanced air defense system than the Ukrainians, so that's not surprising. And if they can shoot down Tochka-Us, they can probably shoot down ATACMS as well, which fly at slower speeds. Just saying. Anyway, there we go. We'll see whether, despite that, the Ukrainians are able to use the ATACMS to achieve some kind of result against the Crimean bridge. But for the record, I can understand why there's been this pressure on the Germans to supply the Taurus missile instead, because as a stealthy missile operating at high subsonic speeds close to the ground, I think actually it would probably cause the Russian air defense system more problems than the ATACMS can do or is doing. Anyway, that's the story of the missile strikes. Devastating Russian missile strikes on Odessa. We have no real information about the success or failure of the Ukrainian ATACMS missile strikes on Crimea, but the initial evidence suggests that they've not been particularly successful. And the comments from Russian officials suggest that they're feeling fairly buoyant about the failure of the ATACMS missile. Now, what's going on in the ground war? Well, a lot is going on. And as always, it is difficult to summarize because it is going on in so many different places at once. But the main attack up to now has been in the area of Avdiivka, Ocheretino. And here all the reports suggest that things for the Ukrainians continue to get dramatically worse. So yesterday, all the reports, including the Ukrainian reports, but not, interestingly, so far, the Russian Defense Ministry, are saying that the villages of Novokalinova and Keramik have fallen under Russian control. There are reports this morning, including one from Julian Röpke, the German journalist from Bild Zeitung, that the Russians are now launching a further attack on the village of Arkhangelskoye, northeast of Ocheretino and northwest of Keramik, that they're launching an attack on this village from two directions. If this village falls, then it is likely that large numbers of Ukrainian troops will either be killed or captured, with significant numbers of Ukrainian troops still to the south of Arkhangelskoye and sandwiched between Ocheretino, Novokalinova and Keramik. So a major disaster there. It also seems as if the Russian advance in the area of Novo-Alexandrovna is continuing. It's been suggested that the Russians aren't actually planning for the moment to attack this village itself, that they seem to be advancing northwest of this particular village. Their objective, again, appears to be to cut off the roads connecting Pokrovsk and the Konstantinovka Chasiv Yar positions, which the Ukrainians occupy further to the west. So I'm not going to get into the details but all the reports suggest accelerating Russian advances in this area from Ocheretino. The Russians are referring to Ocheretino as a flower, the flower that blooms, its petals open, and that enables advances in all kinds of directions, just as a flower opens and its petals point in different directions. The Russians are able to fan out from Ocheretino, which represents the high ground in this area, and advance in all sorts of directions simultaneously, north, east, and west, even as Ukrainian defenses become increasingly disorganized and start to crumble. Now, I've seen it suggested that another purpose of these Russian advances is to start to cut down and break up Ukrainian communications, transport links. The railway lines and the roads in this area supposedly have been essential for the Ukrainians in order to maintain communications and supplies between their various units scattered across Donbas, with the Russians advancing from Ocheretino in various directions. All of those supply lines and transport links and communications lines are at risk, and that also creates the further risk that Ukrainian units will be cut off from each other and unable to support each other, and will be isolated and perhaps fall into cauldrons, and that the Russians can destroy them or defeat each one of them piecemeal. Well, we'll have to wait and see. There's reports also that the Russians, having captured Berdychi and Semenyovka, are now rapidly moving towards clearing up Ukrainian positions immediately to the west, across the fields, and are also in the process of attacking the various villages to the west of these fields in places like Umanske and Yasnobrodovka and others. There's been a number of commentaries about this from various Russian sources. There's been a fairly lengthy discussion about the situation from a Russian observer, military observer. Actually, he's quite an expert, Yevgeny Mikhailov, and he has explained what the capture of Berdychi and Semenyovka might enable the Russians to do. He says, firstly, the encirclement of Ukrainian forces in the Berdychi area. From there, the road opens and an opportunity appears to encircle and defeat the Ukrainian troops that have accumulated in large concentrations in the areas of Selidovo and Pokrovsk. And further on is the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. The Russian military is now capturing important strategic objects virtually daily, which Ukrainian forces do not have time to prepare to defend. In general, big victories await us in the near future. Let's put it this way. And then he goes on to say, they wanted but did not have time to build up a decent defense line and did not expect such a quick offensive and breakthrough by the Russian army. Ukrainian defenses are crumbling. I think it is unlikely that they will have time to properly concentrate their forces in this direction. Moreover, even those forces that are now being deployed, there are more or less elite units sent to try to hold back the advance of the Russians, but this is of little use because in principle we, which is to say the Russians, have an advantage in firepower, a tactical advantage, and the fighting spirit of our units is much higher. Accordingly, I doubt that any line of defense can be created until we reach areas with powerful defensive structures. This includes near Slavyansk and near Kramatorsk. What already exists elsewhere will of course be able to hold back our forces in some areas, but not very powerfully. We are seeing that the front is crumbling, and I think it makes no sense to speak about a serious line of defense. Well, that's Yevgeny Mikhailov. I have read him before. He strikes me as a level-headed and serious person, and he's got a military background and military experience, and I've no reason to challenge his analysis. It seems to me to conform exactly with what we're seeing on the battle lines. And, well, there are now further reports, not always entirely clear, that the Russians have taken more control of more territory in Krasnogorovka, and that the situation of the Ukrainian forces in Krasnogorovka is now critical. There's the 46th Air Assault Brigade, which is tasked with defending the village, was telling us yesterday. And as I said in my program yesterday, it seems to me that the Ukrainians have made a serious mistake, again, in trying to defend this town. It would have made far better sense to withdraw from it sooner. Anyway, a Ukrainian official, a retired Ukrainian official, Oleg Soskin, is also reported to have made comments about the situation. He's talking about an enormous deterioration of the front lines, and all the time, almost every day, settlements are being surrendered one by one. We need to freeze the situation. We need a ceasefire, because there can be no offensive, no return to the 1991 borders. In general, the line cannot be held. Now, that's from Oleg Soskin. Who, as I said, is Ukrainian. That's what he is saying. And again, I've no reason to question the logic of what he's saying. And we're getting news, as well as this situation of the Ocheretino flower blooming, opening its petals, giving the Russians more opportunities for further advances. It looks as if the Russians have now resumed their advance further south, west of Novomikhailivka, and there are reports that the Russians have now begun dropping leaflets on Ukrainian troops in the fortified town of Vuhledar in the south, on the southern front lines, warning them that they're going to be encircled before soon, and offering them the option of surrender. So that's probably more psychological warfare than anything else at the moment. Vuhledar is not yet surrounded, but with Krasnogorovka falling fairly quickly, with the Russians advancing westwards from the Ocheretino area, with the Russians now advancing westwards also from Novomikhailivka. The supply lines to Vuhledar probably will be cut soon. And at some point in the next weeks, what the Russians are describing will probably come true, and that the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar will indeed be cut off, and they will be facing a crisis. Now, that's the south. Elsewhere, in Chasiv Yar, there is now clear signs that the situation has deteriorated for the Ukrainians dramatically, and that a new crisis for the Ukrainian military is now about to develop. Firstly, over the last couple of hours, we have had confirmation that the Russian troops advancing basically from Ivanivska have now reached the canal to the south of the micro district, and that the Russians are now on the canal. They're apparently enlarging the area that they control on the east bank of the canal. And that now creates a pincer situation. The Russians have captured the village of Bogdanovka to the northwest of Chasiv Yar, and now, of course, they're also located to the south along the canal itself, and they're probably in a strong position to cross the canal and advance on the main part of Chasiv Yar itself. The micro-district to the east of the canal, which is being heavily bombed, as I have said, has in effect been encircled. Now, there's been a deeply alarmed article about this whole situation in the Financial Times. And it reads as follows: Ukraine battles to hold vital stronghold Chasiv Yar. Russian forces could attempt a pincer movement to capture more land as Kiev admits frontline situation has worsened. Now, at the start of the program, I said that we're having the first glimmers that the panic is starting to return. I think this article in the Financial Times, which goes strongly against the recent trend of articles in the Financial Times, which have been giving an optimistic spin recently to the situation in Ukraine. Anyway, this article is one of the first telltale signs that the panic is coming back. Now, I'm going to read the first part of it. I'm going to read the entire article because it's very long, but I'm going to read the first part of it. And it's striking how, along with some facts which are provably wrong, or some claims which are provably wrong, it is essentially admitting and for the first time informing British readers, and it's important to say only elite British readers read the Financial Times. It's informing them about the developing crisis on the battlefronts and is informing them of many of the things we've been discussing on these programs now for several days. It's the first clue, for example, about the critical situation that the Ukrainians are facing since the fall of Ocheretino. Anyway, this is what the article says, at least the first part of it. Russia is intensifying its efforts to seize Chasiv Yar, a crucial stronghold in eastern Ukraine, as exhausted and under-equipped Ukrainian brigades struggle to hold the line while waiting for US military aid. Now, the thing that caused the panic briefly to be replaced by euphoria was the vote in the House of Representatives 10 days ago, authorizing a $61 billion appropriation for Ukraine. That was universally expected or reported in the Western media as changing the whole situation. It hasn't done so up to now, but we can see that even as the Financial Times acknowledges the critical situation it clings still to that hope that the US military aid will turn things round. Anyway, we're then told this. Up to 25,000 Russian troops have been deployed near the town in recent weeks, according to a spokesperson for Ukraine's ground forces in the east. In other flashpoints along the front line, Moscow's army is also pressing ahead, seeking to capture as much territory as it can before the arrival of Western kit. It's, again, clinging to the hope that the Western equipment is going to somehow change the situation. Anyway, the article then goes on to say the situation on the front lines has worsened, Ukraine's commander-in-chief Alexander Syrsky said on Sunday. Then Chasiv Yar is seen as a key prize for Moscow, with senior commanders claiming the Russian General Staff has ordered its forces to seize it by May 9th, when Russia celebrates the end of the Second World War. That has never been true, I am sure. I don't believe that the Russian General Staff would ever give such an order. As I have said many times, the Russians have never shown at any time over the course of this conflict that they work to those kind of political timetables. Just saying. But anyway, that's the story the Ukrainians have been clinging to, and that's where it comes from. But then we go on to read this. But Chasiv Yar's importance is strategic rather than symbolic, analysts and Ukrainian servicemen say. A Ukrainian retreat from Chasiv Yar could jeopardize the entire defense of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, collectively known as Donbas. Sat on top of a hill, the city provides Ukraine with one of the last natural barriers protecting the important supply lines, and 30 kilometers to the north, the regional capital of Kramatorsk. Chasiv Yar is the center of gravity for the defensive line in the region, said Viktor Kevlyuk, a military analyst for the Center for Defense Strategies, a Kiev-based security think tank. And then we're told about the effectiveness of the bombs that the Russians are now dropping on Chasiv Yar. We're told that both sides are now battling for control of Bogdanovka and Ivanivska, two villages downhill on the town's flanks. This is not true. We know, and in fact there is ample photographic and film evidence, as well as confirmation from the Russian Defense Ministry, that the Russians captured Bogdanovka and Ivanivska some time ago. I've been reporting this on this program, but well, hey ho, this is the case. This article is written from Ukrainian sources. The Ukrainians are very, very unwilling to admit to the losses of these sort of positions. And then we are told this: Chasiv Yar's defense hangs in large part on a 30-meter wide canal running along the eastern edge of the town. The Soviet-era structure was used to divert water from the Donets River to supply the region's water-hungry metallurgical industries, offers a ready-made obstacle against the passage of armored vehicles. On Tuesday, that's yesterday, Russian troops were inching closer to the canal. And in fact, late yesterday, we had confirmation that they have reached it and that they're now enlarging their control of the east bank of the canal, as I said, south of the micro-district and southeast of Chasiv Yar. And then we go on to read that a bridge over the canal connects the main part of the town with a small micro-district, which Russian soldiers briefly entered earlier this month and which has since been devastated by artillery fire and airstrikes. We then have a map which shows how the Russians might cross the canal south of the micro district. And then we read about how the Russians were able to reach the canal in this area and why it might be possible for the Russians to cross the canal in this area, which they have now reached. Two stretches totaling some 1.5 kilometers where the open air canal is covered provide convenient places for Russian assaults, said Kevliuk from the Center for Defense Strategies. He added that the enemy forces have been attacking very hard here these past 2 weeks, so far without success. But now they've, as we've seen, achieved success. The woods covering the hillsides on which Chasiv Yar sits have also become the scene of fierce fighting. It isn't practical to use drones in the forest. The branches and foliage do not allow us to hit the targets we're interested in, said Yuri Fedorenko, commander of the Achilles Battalion, a Ukrainian drone unit operating in the area. We have other drones that can drop ammunition, like the Baba Yaga heavy bomber, but obviously that isn't sufficient. And then we then go on to read the taking or bypassing Chasiv Yar would allow Russia's artillery, drones and glide bombs to threaten the more vulnerable city of Konstantinovka. Moscow would also be able to disrupt or entirely cut the supply lines running through the city, which Ukraine has been using to link defense efforts in the northern and southern parts of Donetsk. And then we're told that recent Russian advances have been fast, with Russian units further south pushing forward 7 kilometers deep in less than 2 weeks, capturing the village of Ocheretino. Financial Times confirms that Ocheretino has been captured before the Russian Defense Ministry does. That's a first as far as I know. But anyway, there we are. The ground that the Russians have been able to cover these past few months was good defensive terrain for Ukraine, said Rob Lee, a military analyst and senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia program. Now Russia can advance faster. On top of that, taking Chasiv Yar would make other areas that much harder to defend. Recent Russian gains south of Chasiv Yar, this is the Ocheretino, the capture of Ocheretino, have only heightened the town's significance by raising the prospect of a large-scale Russian pincer movement. If advancing Russian forces near Ocheretino are able to make gains along the road leading to Konstantinovka, the entire defense line in the area, which the Russians have not been able to overcome since the beginning of the special military operation, could be surrounded, said Mykola Melnik, a Ukrainian officer and former brigade commander. So there you have it, an attempt by someone, at least, to alert people in Britain and in the United States also, by the way, where I know a lot of well-informed and elite people in Washington read the Financial Times, to the gathering military crisis. The Russians advancing from Ocheretino, outflanking Ukrainian defenses west of Gorlovka, in places like Toretsk and New York, taking Konstantinovka in the rear. The Russians now reaching the canal, which is the main defense line they must cross in order to capture Chasiv Yar. The Russians having reached the defense line precisely in that area where they are in the strongest position to cross it. And the Russians also able to make good use of the forested areas, both to reach the canal, which they have now done, and to cover their troops once they've crossed it. And lots of reports in the article, which I've not discussed, about the power and weight of the Russian artillery and fab bombs that are falling in this area. So, an admission in the Financial Times of the extent of Ukraine's military crisis. And what is the American aid actually going to do? Well, firstly, it's not going to change the situation in the air. The United States has ruled out supplying more Patriot missile systems of its own to Ukraine. These are in short supply. There was an article that I saw yesterday that Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary, is now twisting arms across Europe, trying to get the Europeans to send apparently their entire number of Patriot air defense systems to Ukraine to provide Ukraine with anti-aircraft missile and anti-missile coverage. This, despite the fact that we've seen that the Patriot is of limited effectiveness, that the Russians have no difficulty destroying these launchers and these systems, and given also that stripping the European allies bare of their air defense systems should, in theory, leave them extremely vulnerable to air attack if the danger of that actually existed. Whether the Europeans will indeed comply with this extreme demand from the Americans, I really do wonder. But anyway, we can see that that is what the Americans are trying to get the Europeans to do. And once again, it reflects the urgency. And we've seen the same urgency expressed by Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, over the course of a visit that he's just made to Kiev. Once again, Stoltenberg said that one day, when the war is won, Ukraine will indeed join NATO. An incredibly provocative and reckless statement that he constantly makes at every opportunity, which, as far as I can see, the only effect it can possibly have is to prolong the war, given that for the Russians, keeping Ukraine out of NATO is an overriding priority. But alongside that, Stoltenberg again criticized NATO member states for holding on to their weapons. The priority, according to Stoltenberg, is not for European armies to hold on to their weapons, the better to defend their own countries. The priority is to give them to Ukraine instead, where they get burnt up at incredible speed. That already should tell us that this American package, appropriations package, is not going to be anywhere close to being enough. And note that it seems that the Ukrainians are not getting the weapon systems that they would really need in order to stabilize the situation on the front lines. The last American package did not provide more tanks. The performance of the Abrams tanks in Ukraine has been disappointing, to say the least. By the way, there's a superb video about this by Brian Beletic, talking about the Challenger 3 tank, Britain's new heavy tank, which is essentially the same as the Challenger 2 tank, except that it's bigger and heavier, but uses the same engine, so that its mobility problems which have already essentially rendered it ineffectual on the Ukrainian battle lines, well, those problems are going to be aggravated even further. As Brian Beletic says, the only advance of the Challenger 3 over the Challenger 2 is that finally the British have accepted that rifled tank guns, which they've clung on to, are not optimal for modern tank warfare. The Russians started to introduce smoothbore, high-velocity smoothbore guns to their tanks back in the 1960s. The British have only finally now decided to drop the rifled guns. But apparently the Challenger 3 will finally use a smoothbore gun. I understand, made in Germany, by the way, just saying. But anyway, tanks not being supplied to Ukraine, Western tanks have failed on the Ukrainian battlefields. Ukraine desperately short of infantry fighting vehicles. The United States so far only apparently providing 12 old Bradleys. Artillery now in desperately short supply. Shells in desperately short supply. And the anti-aircraft missile systems that might hold back the Russian Air Force not being supplied in quantity either, and desperately vulnerable to Russian destruction by the Russians, quick destruction by the Russians when they are supplied. So, at some point over the next few weeks, perhaps when Chasiv Yar falls, we will see the panic that started with the fall of Avdiivka come back with renewed force. Only at that point, we will be closer to election day in the United States, and of course, the Bolt, which is the $61 billion aid package for Ukraine, has already been shot, coming back to Congress and asking for still more is going to inevitably invite further criticism and more questions. And anyway, it still wouldn't turn the situation round. Now, I've discussed how the Western weapons in Ukraine have not been a great success. The Russians have now today, as of today, opened their new exhibition, or their exhibition in Moscow, of the weapons that Western weapons that they have captured on the Ukrainian battlefields. This exhibition has attracted a huge amount of attention. It was the subject of some incredibly ill-advised and sarcastic commentary from Jens Stoltenberg, for example. But anyway, given that they have captured all of these weapons, it's given the Russians bragging rights. And we've had a piece from the Russian Defense Ministry about this. They said that the exhibition that the Russian Defense Ministry opens its exhibition of captured weapons and hardware in Victory Park in Moscow. The exhibition is divided into several thematic zones and is accompanied by information stands on the countries of manufacture, tactical and technical characteristics, and places and circumstances of capture by Russian servicemen. We're told that more than 30 samples of military hardware produced by the United States, Britain, Germany, France, Sweden, Finland, Austria, Turkey, Australia, South Africa, and Ukraine are presented in this open area. And then we're given a list of some of the weapon systems, which include Abrams, an Abrams tank, Leopard 2s, French AMX 10RCs, German Marders, US Bradleys, well, all those sort of things. And we are told, finally, there's this resplendent statement at the end: strength is truth, strength is in truth. It's always been that way, as in 1943, as today. We feel Russian strength in these trophies. The more there are, the stronger we are. More than 80 years ago, from 1943 to 48, an exhibition of trophy weapons captured from Germany in 1941 to 43 was held in the Moscow Gorky Central Park of Culture and Rest, one of the samples of which is presented today: a German-made Marder anti-tank self-propelled artillery system. So the Russians are making the connection. They're trundling out a World War II German self-propelled gun, and they're adding it to this exhibition just to make the point that enemies of the motherland, whoever they are, face the same outcome. And then this commentary from the Russians finishes, from the Russian Defense Ministry, says, "Our victory is inevitable. No Western military hardware will change the situation on the battlefield. The enemy will be defeated." And as to that last comment, I absolutely agree. I think that is certainly the truth. We've seen the West supply huge numbers of weapons to Ukraine, tens, even hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons to Ukraine. It has not changed the outcome. We've seen there might be problems with the ATACMS missiles. I've discussed this earlier in the program. They're not going to be the great game changer that people say. The F-16s are not going to be the game changer that people say. By the way, there was a crash of an F-16 the other day at a airfield in Arizona, as one of the members of the Duran community pointed out to me. That is the same airfield in Arizona where Ukrainian pilots are supposed to be training on the F-16s. Well, I'm not going to jump and make connections that I don't know about, but anyway, you can make those connections if you choose. The F-16s are not going to change the situation, nor are the ATACMS, nor are any other weapons that the Western powers can provide. Dmitry Medvedev, the head or the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, also spoke on the occasion of May Day, which is of course today, a major public holiday in Russia. He said that he talked about the enormous increase in military production, but he said that the upswing, the general upswing of the Russian economy makes this sustainable indefinitely and gives the Russians the confidence in victory that they have. Now, a couple of days ago, the Financial Times, which now admits this gathering disaster for Ukraine on the battlefronts, had a long piece about how the arrest in Moscow of a apparently corrupt deputy minister of the Russian military, who'd been accused of taking a 1 million ruble bribe, how that indicated that Sergei Shoigu, Russia's defense minister, was on the way out. Supposedly, the arrest of this this deputy minister was a blow in a power struggle in the Kremlin against Shoigu. I have never myself paid much attention to Kremlinology, which is what this is an example of. Many years ago, when I was a student, I took it seriously. That was when I was studying Soviet and Russian history at that time, and to some extent Soviet politics at that time. I've long since become disillusioned with the whole science, if that's what it can be called. And anyway, the thesis of the Financial Times article, which is that Shoigu is keen to remain at the helm of the defense ministry, is, I am reliably told, wrong. I have been independently told by two completely different sources, both of them extremely reliable, one of which has had historic contacts with Shoigu, that in fact, far from being keen to remain in post, Shoigu, before the special military operation, was actually preparing for his retirement and remains keen, when the war is over, to quit. Just saying. But anyway, Shoigu, far from being sacked, has just turned up in Rostov-on-Don, where he has had a meeting with the senior military who are conducting the special military operation. And again, the Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with a brief report. We're told that during the meeting, the Russian Defense Minister noted that the group of forces continued to carry out tasks in operational areas in accordance with the plan of the special military operation, and pointed to the need to further increase the supply of weapons, military hardware, and means of destruction. In order, and this is a direct quote from him, in order to maintain the required pace of the offensive and ensure the build-up of the combat strength of the groups of forces for further actions, it is necessary to increase the volume and quality of weapons and military hardware supplied to the troops. First of all, the means of destruction. And that is a quote of what Shoigu said. Now, there are two enormously interesting revelations from this report. The first is that note that we are told that there is a plan and that the Russians are acting in accordance with it. During the meeting, the Russian defense minister noted that the group of forces continue to carry out tasks in operational areas in accordance with the plan of the special military operation. So there is a plan. It is apparently being followed. Things are going according to this plan. That is what Shoigu has told us. But then the other revelation from this report is even more important. And this is again comes in the direct quote the Defense Ministry has given us of Shoigu's words. In order to maintain the required pace of the offensive. That is the first time I have seen the Russians acknowledge that a Russian offensive is actually underway. Up to now, they have spoken about active defense. Now, for the first time, no less a person than Russia's defense minister tells us that there is an offensive and that this offensive is proceeding according to a plan. I think this is a very consequential report from the Defense Ministry indeed, and I think that Western intelligence agencies are probably studying it at this time, and I hope are reporting on its proper implications to their superiors, though Who knows? Anyway, we will see what happens on the Ukrainian battlefields over the next couple of days. But as I said, for the moment, the situation is bad, bordering on catastrophic. The Financial Times is edging towards admitting as much, and the Russians are on the offensive. And there is a major encirclement of Ukrainian troops being threatened and a potential loss of Chasiv Yar, which we are now officially told, or semi-officially being told, is a strategic location, the loss of which will unhinge the entire Ukrainian defense system in Donbas. Now, before I leave this discussion about matters of the Ukrainian war, let me just make one particular point. Last year, during the Battle of Bakhmut, we were repeatedly told in the Western media that Bakhmut was only of symbolic importance, that it had no strategic value, that the Russians were intent on capturing Bakhmut because of its symbolic significance. I even remember reading articles, especially in the British media, in which we were told that British officials and Western officials were expressing puzzlement at the Russian focus on Bakhmut, given the town's complete lack of strategic importance. Well, a year later, suddenly the entire narrative has changed. We're told that a Ukrainian retreat, this is taking again from the Financial Times article, a Ukrainian retreat from Chasiv Yar would jeopardize the entire defense of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, collectively known as Donbas. Sat on top of a hill, the city provides Ukraine with one of the last natural barriers protecting important supply lines and 30 kilometers to the north, the regional capital of Kramatorsk. How do you get to Chasiv Yar? You have to capture Bakhmut. The Russians captured Bakhmut last year. They were not able to press forward with their attack on Chasiv Yar at that time because they had to deal with Ukraine's summer offensive. And after the summer offensive was ended, their focus was on Avdiivka and then Ocheretino, with the results that we now see. But clearly, Bakhmut was not of symbolic importance. It was of immense strategic importance. And it is opening the way. Its capture is opening the way for the Russians to capture Chasiv Yar as well, which we're told will unhinge the whole of Ukrainians' defense positions in Donbas. It's interesting how much of a difference a year can make. And by the way, and for the record, the Financial Times was one of the main outlets that was propagating the myth about the symbolic as opposed to strategic importance of Bakhmut. And now we see that they are publishing pieces that admit how important strategically Bakhmut was after all. They're never going to admit to the change, but those of us who have memories of these things should not forget them. Anyway, let's now discuss quickly something else, which is that there are reports the Israeli authorities have complained to the US administration about the threats of warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and his senior officials from the ICC. And we've had warnings from Congress that if the ICC dares to issue warrants against against Prime Minister Netanyahu and those top Israeli officials, the United States will take strong action against the ICC. Now, I don't know what the Biden administration itself is going to do, but quite plausibly, they will also now try to strong-arm the ICC to drop any idea it might have about issuing warrants for the arrest of Prime Minister Netanyahu and his officials. Now, if that happens, if the United States is successful, does that, and is successful in doing it, if the ICC, having supposedly decided to issue warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and other top officials, then drops its plan of doing that under American pressure, then all I will say is that that will be the final destruction of whatever credibility the ICC still has. Firstly, it will expose the extent of American influence over the ICC, even though the United States is not itself a party to the Rome Statute, which is, of course, the founding statute which created the ICC. In fact, the United States has gone out of its way to say that the ICC has no jurisdiction over the United States and that the United States would take extreme action if the ICC were ever to issue warrants against US officials. Just saying. But anyway, if this thing plays out in the way that's been reported, then the ICC will have been exposed as an American stooge. If it is really the case that the ICC is planning to issue warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and US officials, but the United States blocks it from doing so, then the United States will have directly interfered in its processes, despite the fact that, as I said, it is not a party to the Rome Statute, and the ICC will have bowed before American power, exposing its complete lack of independence from the United States. I have to say that I find this astonishing and extraordinary. I wonder whether the ICC would be able to survive. I think its credibility in Africa, which already is tattered, will be completely shot to pieces. And I think its credibility around most of the rest of the world will be shot to pieces also. But there it is. I'm not sure that the ICC was ever actually planning to issue warrants against top Israeli officials. But note that it has not denied up to this time that it did have that plan, which makes it likely that it did. And we already see how this is all playing out. That's a curious fact. For the rest, we hear that the United States is sitting back, sitting on its hands, as Israel finally cranks up to attack Rafah in Gaza. And, well, I've been getting reports this morning, I've been seeing reports this morning that the New York police force has now cleared the protests in Columbia University, which I find unsurprising to say the least. Anyway, protests in some places good, others bad. But well, we've seen that many times. Anyway, there we are. This is where I'm going to finish the program today. I expect the Russian advances in Ocheretino to continue. I also expect the build-up of Russian forces around Chasiv Yar to grow, and I myself also suspect that before long the Russians will cross the canal and that the battle of Chasiv Yar will begin in earnest. It seems to me that the reason why there hasn't been an attack on Chasiv Yar up to now, an attempt to storm Chasiv Yar up to now, is that the Russians have not yet put all their forces in the correct positions, but soon they will be able to do that. And Shoigu has just told us that they are well and truly on the offensive and that they have a plan. Is there a plan on the other side? Do the Ukrainians have a plan? Well, the media in the West has told us not. Speaker Johnson has, in the past, asked the Biden administration for its plan, how the war in Ukraine is to be conducted and won. We've never seen the Biden administration ever come up with one. Seymour Hersh has just written a piece about the fact that the Biden administration has never solicited from the intelligence community a big national intelligence assessment assessing the whole situation with Ukraine and Russia and working out and providing a pool of data as to how the war should be conducted at any point since it took office. Apparently, it's never solicited such an assessment from the intelligence community at all, at any time, at any point in its existence. So we see that one side has a plan, the other side doesn't. Is it a surprise that the one side which has the plan is winning and the other side which doesn't have the plan is losing? And in the absence of a plan and with defeat looming fast over the horizon, the panic before long, I predict, will come back anew. Well, thank you for joining me again for this program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Please remember to check out our shop. You can find all sorts of amazing things there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to check your subscription to this channel and tick the like button to this video. Thank you very much for joining me again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.